Okay, I think we'll get started. I'm Nicole Reynolds from the Diplo Foundation, and I'd like to welcome our panelists today. We have Richard Sterling, who is the co-founder and CEO of Oxford Analytics, which is a consulting firm that helps governments implement and deploy their AI strategies. We have Michael Street, the head of innovation and data science from NATO, and Micah Verbrogen, who is an international security policy researcher, from the Institute of European Studies. So I thought we would start off by having each of our panelists give a few minutes of overview of their views on the topic and things that they would like to cover. So, Richard?
Okay, so the brief for this was to talk about the impact of AI on geopolitics. And you've already heard that AI kind of acts as a power amplifier. And it acts as a power amplifier when you're thinking about the sort of power of a nation state. Be that economic power, like the countries who are best able to harness AI are probably going to see increased growth in GDP, higher GDP per capita, and much more economic might. In the military fields, like we've had a couple of questions so far on autonomous weapons, and that's one field in which AI can impact on the military. But it also translates to all of the other stuff that militaries do. You know, it's everything down to the really boring job of making sure the right people are in the right place at the right time with the right equipment. You know, both the location of it and the sort of where should your people be, but also the logistics. And those are both tasks that AI are really good at. But also in the sort of diplomatic. And you heard the example of Cognitive Trade Advisor earlier, where AI can be used as a tool to augment the field of diplomacy and help people come into it. Help people use the skills that they're really best at, like dealing with people one-on-one, rather than all of the marshalling of information and finding insight. Now, to me, this poses a couple of questions. One is the sort of individual country question of like, if I think that this is a good thing, and a number of countries are doing AI strategies, how do I make sure that I do the best thing? Like, where is my comparative advantage? What are the areas in which I should be invested? Am I a producer of AI, or am I taking an AI from somewhere else, and the job is around integration into my sectors, because that's going to be where I will outcompete. The next is a kind of question of collective action. Now, there are some topics in AI which are a bit controversial or could be problematic. There are questions around the ethical limits. There's a question around this power imbalance. If AI is really a power shift, do we end up in a world, as we have in defence contracting at the moment, where there are a few really big players, and actually there's a bit of a power asymmetry? And I would argue you could see some of that in the big internet giants at the moment. You know, we need collective action to properly regulate an organisation like Facebook, because they're everywhere, and pervasive, and huge. And so I see there are challenges in both. And how do you have countries competing whilst they're still collaborating? And if there are areas of AI research that you don't want people to go into, how do you stop that? And I'm just going to pose a final question, which is like, on stopping that, you know, AI development is really different to, say, nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, capital intensive, lots of traces, really difficult to move things. AI, you don't really need any capital. You need a server farm and you need some really smart people. That's much harder to regulate, it's much harder to audit. So how do you make sure nobody's cheating even once you've got the compact?
Great. Michael?
Thanks very much. Michael Street. I work for the NATO Communication and Information Agency, so we provide the ICT, the technology support to NATO, both in headquarters and all across the command structure and elsewhere. In my team, one of the things that we do is deliver. I really hate the word AI. In fact, everybody in my team gets they get very nervous whenever I whenever I I use the acronym AI, they always get nervous because they're the experts, they understand it, they do it. We term it more data science. We have a data science team that includes predictive analytics, it includes machine learning, deep learning, and it includes data collection, data collection, data management. And I think in one of the challenges that we have, or certainly one of the most important roles, is to make sure that the people that we serve and that we can provide these AI and AI-like services to understand what the technology can do, understand what the technology can't do, which is perhaps more important, and understand some of those ethical, those policy implications that might limit what they can do or need to be put in place to allow it to be used in an effective but sensible and ethical way. In terms of some of the key things that we're involved in, I typically, and it was nice to see in the report that it does talk about the importance of data, because AI is always driven by data, or it should be. And the quality of the data, not just the quantity, though quantity has a big impact, but the quality of that data is fundamental to the quality of the AI, the resulting guidance or decision making that you might get. Very often in the projects that we're running at the moment, almost exclusively, we have some level of human engagement in review or annotation of the data that we're using. So access to people who understand the context and the context and the topics of the data that you're looking at, and to understand enough of the technology to be able to annotate it in the right sort of way or give the right sort of guidance. That's a fundamental thing for us. Just a little quick straw poll. Have any of you heard the term data poisoning? Show of hands.
Data poisoning?
Data poisoning, yeah. So just, if you're looking to use AI or data to improve your ability or your situation in a particular scenario, and somebody else, there's some adversary or some other group who may not wish you to be more effective in your task or in your position, if they know that you're going to look at some data and use that to inform your position, then it's possible they may influence that data in order to influence your decision making. So that influencing data, or data poisoning, is a term which is just starting to come into use. The concept has been around for a while, but also it's something which has an impact on what we do, where we might take data from, and the types of work that you might want to do before you start exploiting that data. So data is one key thing, technology is another, making sure, as Richard and others have said, the technologies are available to almost anybody now, if you can pay. The technologies, the amount of computation, the amount of storage, the kinds of models, and tools are available to almost anybody if you can pay for it. So in one respect that's leveled the playing field, on another it's driven it to a very extreme, because the people who've got the most effective model or the most effective tools will get disproportionate benefit. One of the things that we found from our work is that the amount that you pay for the tool is not necessarily commensurate with the performance. So, another quick straw poll, how many of you here are from government organisations? Okay. If you go away, if I could say one thing today, it's the amount you pay is not proportional to the quality. Bear that in mind. There's a lot of hype in the subject at the moment, particularly from salespeople from large IT organisations, and that's something which needs to be borne in mind. And part of our role is also expectation management, because there are some hype mongers in the environment and in the community, and just balancing that, the expectation of what you can really get, the kind of performance, the kind of timescale, the amount of effort that humans need to put in before you get the benefit of AI, is something which I think really needs more understanding. So thank you.
Great, thank you. Micah.
Thank you very much. So for background, I work on military innovation AI, so that's the field I know best. So with that said, one thing I think is important to keep in mind, that we should think of AI as a general purpose technology. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but you should think about it as an enabling technology that can help innovation downstream in other fields and other sectors. In a way that means that the way that the technology is developed and diffused over the world doesn't necessarily match how this has happened for other types of technologies that are more system oriented, so to say. So when we think about the economic implications, that means that it's not just very serious radical changes in only in the tech fields, in the tech companies. And when we think about military innovation, traditionally, it means that we'll also see the way that it diffuses won't necessarily hold the same patterns that we see in the previous decades. But it also doesn't necessarily mean that we can immediately transfer everything we have in the civilian world to the military world either. A lot of discussions seem to kind of equate the civilian innovation in AI by countries to the military innovation. Well, it is far from that simple. My main point, I guess, as I'm originally a historian by background, that I want to also urge some caution in a few ways. It's not the first time that we're all about AI, it's the third time already. The previous two times have died out because of too high expectations that could never be met, the continuous shifting of the goalpost. When I talk to especially academics, I think there's a rather large consensus that what people believe AI can do soon, that's never going to happen. So we also should temper our expectations a little bit and think also, try to take a step back before we build the world on AI and what it can do in the future.
Let's not build castles in the sky.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, great. So you all touched on a wide range of topics that are all relevant, and I'd like to start with kind of a high-level question around various strategies being pursued by all the countries of the world. It seems like we've got kind of a gold rush going on in AI, similar to other things in the past. And so if you could each talk a little bit about how the capabilities of AI are going to create potentially a new arms race or shape national strategies, that would be really interesting.
Okay. So you've described it as a gold rush, which I think neatly pins the main reason that countries are focused on this at the moment is that they see the economic benefits coming through and they want some of that for their own industry. Depending on the country, then you're seeing either a rush towards trying to acquire all of the talent, and the obvious ones here are America, which has just had an influx of talent into Silicon Valley for the last 40 years on the back of some pretty heavy defense spending up front. China, which is churning out a huge amount of research in this area, particularly around facial recognition. And you can, it actually reflects a bit the sort of integrated way that the government is into the business world. Like, it's really useful for the Chinese government to have the world's best image recognition and facial tracking systems in its own country. I'm not going to judge why that is, but you can see the private industry and the research labs churning out that world-leading research, and I think the government is a very helpful customer. But then I want to call out, I think there was someone from Canada in the back. Like, the Canadian approach to getting talent was amazing. You mentioned that there have been this is the third time round with AI, Micah. Well, like, Canada was in the happy position of having the unfashionable field of machine learning being based almost pretty much in its backyard. There were 3 centres. There was Stanford, and then there was Montreal, and there was a third one. I can't remember where it was in
MIT.
Yeah. MIT, but MIT was going more down semantic and knowledge graphs rather than machine learning. But Canada went, okay, fantastic, we've got the world leading centre in this, but all the people go through the university and then leave the Silicon Valley for money. As part of Justin Trudeau's push for AI, then they established a centre, and they phoned people up and said, now is the time to give back to your country. I want 5 years. I want you to come back home for 5 years and help us be a world leader in AI and to make sure that we have the right frameworks and we have the right ethics. I think it's an amazing approach and a great way to compete with national pride when almost nobody can compete with the money of Silicon Valley and nobody has the same sort of state license to come in that you see in China or Russia.
Michael?
No, that's a really good point, and actually it's something which we're starting to see being replicated in other areas as well. For example, in the Netherlands, where they've also had a big push of data science for good, as they term it, and recognising that you may not be able to compete purely on salary or share options with some of the big commercial players. But actually, if you can pay people a reasonable amount, have them work in a reasonable environment, and give them a task which is making the world a better place, well, you can still get some really good, talented people working in that environment. I think we've seen in our world in defence innovation a complete turnaround from, say, 50 years ago, or the height of the Cold War, when all of the technology innovation started off in defence, and then moved into industry in the commercial world, and finally ended up in the hands of consumers, where for the last decade or two, the new technology starts off in the hands of consumers, probably teenage ones, and then it works through into the commercial world, and finally it gets to defence. And this has led to a rise in the amount of dual-use technology that the defence community is working with. B, it opens up some different challenges in terms of accessibility to that technology, because, as you said before, pretty much everybody has got access to it at some level. It's just how that can be exploited. And a part of that then comes into not just the technology, but the training, the understanding of the decision makers, the leaders, the political level and the military level, of how they understand what the technology can do, how they understand the limitations, and also some of the ethical issues and policy issues around that in terms of making use of that technology in an appropriate way. And I think historically we have, perhaps in the West, we have historically a quite conservative approach to a lot of policies, particularly things around data at the moment, and that's something which maybe is going to be reviewed and maybe could be an area of challenge, where different nations and different parts of the world, different regions are going to have different approaches to that, recognising that where data comes from, how it's used, and how it's exploited, how it's applied, is going to have some difference. I think we had one of the speakers, one of the questions earlier this morning raised the idea of meaningful human intervention, and in the military community that's a very key term, and we've often used to talk about having a human in the loop on any AI application or anything where you've got computers or acting semi-autonomously. But given the speed of response of things, that's now shifted to be some cases where you want to have a human in the loop being involved in the technology, and some cases where you want to have a human on the loop. So not necessarily involved of getting a decision and deciding whether to act on it or not, but at least able to override it if it's needed. Because in some areas, again, a question this morning talked about cybersecurity. There are some things where some of these decisions just happen too quickly. The events happen too fast for a human to react in a reasonable space of time. So there are some areas where there will be some autonomy, there will be machine learning, which is driving that, which is making decisions, and systems will be acting. There will be some human oversight, but there won't be some human flicking a switch or pushing a button to decide whether to act or not, because by the time you've alerted the human, you're already going to be too late.
Micah?
I'll first say I'm always a little bit hesitant to talk about an arms race, because it's really a self-fulfilling prophecy, that question. The more you question, is there an arms race, the more you create the sense that there is an arms race. And also development of AI is not a zero-sum game, especially in the economic field. And if we get the sense we must develop quickly before the others do, then we don't take the time to stand back. Are we sure that it's safe? Are we sure it's inclusive? All these larger questions. But that said, there's definitely a clear interest in military AI for the strategic, technical benefits that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Increased speed, increased efficiency, operating where other people like dual dangerous, dirty environments, but also in a more strategic balance of power sense. You know, the US is super interested, so China says, okay, if the US is interested, we are also interested. And then in Europe, there's also a sense, okay, well, we must also, in a way, keep up with the US. So it is this cascading factor. And of course, also in the military world, there's a hype. It is the big thing, and it's also what makes your military modern, strong. It's a symbol for being a modern, very capable military. And one also very interesting thing is the question to what extent AI requires AI to counter it. If AI becomes so fast in a way that humans can't keep up, do you need defensive AI systems, vice versa, to be able to deal with that? And that, of course, risks the classic security dilemma that that countries have to develop military technology to keep up with the others. But that said, I would also see a couple of obstacles to this development. I mean, of course, for one, there is the do-use capacity for sure, but you can't just transfer to the military field. The militaries generally have much higher standards when it comes to safety, when it comes to testing. It is much more extensive than the civilian field. There's much more additional research that's needed. Military innovation is also, you know, we're talking about decades of development versus the months of Silicon Valley. It is radically different speeds. There's a big aspect of trust as well by the soldiers. A lot of actual soldiers in the field, they are skeptical about AI. They don't want to give away control. They don't want to lose their job. They don't want to lose their identity. And it requires a lot of training. A lot of this stuff is much more, it's very difficult to deal with, less intuitive than, say, more mechanical weapons. So there are also definitely some clear obstacles to the further militarization of AI as well.
So I'd like to continue on that point a little bit. With the development of lethal autonomous weapons and the like, how does this impact global stability and security going forward? And does this change the mission of NATO? So Michael, why don't you lead off with that one?
Oh, thanks for that more contentious question. So here I should say that NATO, let's start by saying that NATO is an incredibly innovative organisation. At a time, very often in innovation conferences, we hear people citing Airbnb because the world's largest accommodation provider has no hotel rooms, and the world's largest taxi company has no vehicles, and the world's biggest media provider produces no content. And actually, 70 years before all of these, the world's largest military organisation has no weapons, because NATO doesn't. What NATO does is it connects the information between people who have weapons, people who have situational awareness, people who have information, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance data, with commanders who want to make it, who want to have an operational impact. That's NATO's added value. So actually, I would say that NATO has been economy 2.0, half a century before the economy 2.0. So in that respect, it's nice to see the rest of the world catching up. But it also puts me at a disadvantage talking about autonomous weapons, because that's not something which NATO as an organisation will be doing. However, it is aware that the nations the member nations of NATO will have or may have autonomous weapons, and there are some issues that come in alongside that. One of the things where and there is also a lot of collaboration between the 29 member nations of NATO on the subject of military application of artificial intelligence and data science, as we really should say. One of those issues I just mentioned before about human in the loop or human on the loop, as to whether things could be, how much human control and how much delay of humans you want to have involved in those things. One of the other things where this comes in is to understand where you have perhaps not decision-making systems, but perhaps advice systems, using AI to be able to take in a huge raft of information about what's happening currently, about previous similar situations, and maybe to be able to give a commander advice on well, these are possible routes, possible lines to take. You could do this, and the risks would be that, and the opportunities would be that. You could do this. That's kind of environment happens at the moment with their staff officers, in that a commander can ask your staff officer, what should we do here? Or what does the intelligence tell us? What's the situation of our logistics? What's the logistics situation? And they can get that advice, or they can get a summary, and then they can ask, and why do you think that? Why do you recommend that course of action? And that's one of the challenges for AI, is to be able to interrogate it, to understand why it's making the kind of recommendations that it is. And I think that's one of the, I'm not claiming that we have a solution for it, but that's one of the areas where we're starting to see a lot of focus, is not just in how you apply it, but how you understand the rationale. Because there are many reasons why you might not want to follow something which is, on paper, it's 20%. It's a 20% more successful solution than option B, because there might be some aspects which just don't come out in that in a purely mathematical analysis.
Micah?
Yeah, there some really good points. I think what you highlight very well is that it's much broader than laws, military AI. They're so much more interested than the autonomous weapon systems, and I think it's extremely important that we discuss it. I think we also should keep an eye on all these other developments that are also ongoing, and that also have the chance to impact the global security. For instance, one thing that I think might be pretty interesting for the diplomatic world is what does it mean for conflict, escalation, for instance. Katrina, I think, already mentioned the early warning detection, so that's a very positive thing. But also the question, what does AI for logistics deployment, what does that mean for conflict escalation? If countries can deploy much quicker, what does that mean? If we can analyze much quicker, what does that mean for taking a step back, deliberating, analyzing? There's the question, what does it mean about the threshold to war? If it's not that AI is going to replace humans, but if it reduces the risks to humans, and also if it reduces the economic costs, which is also a real goal for countries to develop AI, what does it mean for their likeliness to actually go to war? There is the question, for instance, what does it mean about asymmetrical risk? If Western companies with their artificial intelligence are so hard to touch, what does it mean about that non-state armed groups or countries with less military capabilities? How are they going to shift in their tactics? Are they going to shift to hitting Western countries where it hurts, where they're actually vulnerable, their demographic populations? Or does it mean that they'll go more in retreat? If everything is always visible through satellite image with drones, will they go underground? Will they retreat back into cities? How does that change that type of warfare? So this, yeah, I think the security implications, the global power relations that we should keep in mind are much larger in this than the autonomous weapon systems.
Richard, would you like to comment?
So I'm not as expert in the field of military as the other panelists, but what occurs to me is that people often leap immediately to their most sophisticated understanding of AI and what it can do, and then apply it to the field. And in a number of other public services fields, then if you look at the sort of almost the 5 levels of AI, people jump to like the 5th level, like AI can do absolutely everything and we won't need any people. I suspect that the truth is that AI will come in at sort of level 1, level 2, where it looks very much like the data science that went before. There might be the odd thing which comes in at sort of maybe level 3, where you need a human to supervise. Maybe we'll have a bit like a self-driving car. We might have a self-driving tank with someone who can take over the reins if it gets too much. And that will translate into the different fields of pursuing war. Now, to me, that means that I would be worried about cybersecurity. How do you protect the integrity of the systems? And I'd also echo your point, Michael, on just being a little bit of healthy skepticism on, can the magic AI system that you're being told will work, will it actually work? and the point that you made, Micah, of almost war pursuit through other means, and the use of AI in disinformation, dissemination, undermining people's democracies, I think is a really live topic and one that people should be alive to.
Great, thank you. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about data policy. So no conference in Brussels on AI would be complete without mentioning GDPR. So I'd like to start with you, Richard. How does GDPR shape Europe's competitive position globally in AI? And is it an advantage, disadvantage, and how does Europe position itself between the US and China?
Okay. So on GDPR particularly, I opened by talking about this sort of competition for talent between broadly like North America, China, Russia, Europe. Each of them are taking different approaches. Each of them have a different way of developing AI. I feel like Europe's big advantage and point of difference, I can never quite shake off being an economist at heart. I always think comparative advantage, is the fact that Europe is the forum which is pushing for almost an ethical AI. It's pushing for the use of AI, use of data in society in a way which respects the European constitutional settlement. It respects privacy. GDPR is a fantastic example of how that can work and play out in practice. And also how doing action at the level of the European Union brings to bear the collective action and the collective weight of the European Union as the world's largest trading bloc to be able to take those standards and apply them to international companies. So for me, GDPR is a great comparative advantage for Europe because it creates regulatory certainty. It creates a framework where people know that their rights are being respected. GDPR as a technical piece of regulation is being looked at favourably as a possible model to copy in Asian countries, in North American countries, in Latin American countries, because it seems to work. Now, that's not to say it's perfect and there aren't teething difficulties, but that's a completely different conference. For now, I think the point is that it creates certainty and it creates a world where people know the tools developed in Europe will respect the rights of citizens and the rights of customers, which is something that as AI pushes the boundaries and moves up from sort of level 2, level 3 towards the 4, 5, it will do things that are perpetually more and more creepy. And how do you convince the consumer that the creepy thing is okay? Well, it's governed by the law that says that you can't do anything like really evil. So GDPR, great example of that.
Great, don't be evil. Okay, Michael.
I'd echo those. I think it's there's a lot of scepticism and fear about it at the time. I think as people have understood it, read it, implemented it, I think there's a recognition that it sets a very good balance between the rights of consumers and individuals and making that data available in a way that adds some value either economically or to the individuals. And I think so on a positive side, as Richard said, it does mean that if you do something which is able to operate within the bounds of GDPR, then it's probably something which you can use anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. Whereas the converse is not necessarily true. Now, on one hand, that means that it does make Europe perhaps a focal point for, it's a good place to bring data, it's a good place to do development because it will be applicable everywhere. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, if you do want to talk about competitive advantage, then maybe you've got a policy which does limit you and does restrict what you can do and how you can handle that data. So maybe that is a regional disadvantage. One of the things from our perspective within NATO is very often we deal with data which is not necessarily bound by GDPR, which is not public. Mm-hmm. However, the relevant strategy and policy for how we handle data whether it's coming from the 29 member nations, whether it's coming from outside, whether it's being generated ourselves, how that data's handled and how it can be exploited or how you can extract value from that data is something which is very high on the agenda and something which we're working on right now.
Great, thank you, Micah.
I think you two touched most what I wanted to say. I wanted to add 2 points. One is that I often hear in these discussions, well, it will be a negative, it will be disadvantage, for instance, vis-a-vis China. And I think it would be, people often underestimate the extent of data protection in China, especially the last year. There's been a lot of activity by the Chinese government to develop laws and push back and put more limits for private companies and what they collect in data on personal citizens. I'm not thinking about the Chinese government themselves here, but at least companies. I think there are more limitations on personal data than people might think at first glance. The second point that I think that's very interesting that developed also due to the GDPR is the question about data protectionism and the argument of privacy as, so to say, as an excuse not to share data and to enhance your own competitiveness of countries. I see that being used as an argument, say, within for countries to keep their own data so they don't have to share it, for instance. And I'm curious to see how that develops further. But on the other hand, I'm also want to warn about phrasing, presenting privacy as only something that people care about for the sake of protecting data for their own economic interest. But I do think it's an interesting development.
Great. So we only have a few minutes left, and I feel like we could keep going, but we do need to get to some audience questions. So if there are questions, right here in the front.
I don't think I need a mic, but that's
Better for him.
Yes, just introduce yourself and tell us where you're from.
My punishment for asking a question. So hi, I'm Dr. Niklas Nowak from the World Trade Marketing Center for European Studies. Given that the panel has the word geostrategic on the title, I'd like to hear a little bit more about how AI affects the international balance of power. Richard especially kind of mentioned already that it's a type of power amplifier.
Just shift you.
Could you expand a little bit on that point, and especially like what it means for Europe in that balance of power? And then to either Michael or Mike, to what extent AI or data science manifests or represents a new revolution in military affairs? Thanks.
Would you like to go first?
Okay, so on the balance of power question, so I said I saw AI as a power amplifier. Now that can be used as a rebalancing. So in the example of a trade negotiation, if you have a smaller delegation, but your delegation is using the AI to do all of the legwork going into it, suddenly you're not pushed out by the delegation that's 5 times the size. That sort of plays out on a larger scale. To me, the risk is around the entrenching existing power imbalances, where countries that aren't able to invest find themselves slightly left behind. I use the forming of a phrasing of either being a producer of AI systems or a consumer. And that's because at the moment, a lot of the research is done in clusters. It's a very new field. There are only so many clusters in the world. That means there's probably only so many places that will be able to produce it. Everybody else will then it's around translating it. That to me risks entrenching some of the power balances. And you asked specifically about the EU. And I think that the European Union have a great AI strategy in that they're looking at making sure that some of those clusters develop in the European Union. If I could wave a magic wand, then I would increase the emphasis on translation into the private sector, because I think that that's one of the fields that the US does really well, basically because it all starts in the private sector and then gets pushed back in. Europe works slightly differently. We let our researchers push a bit harder. I would want to see them invest a bit more into translating that, and translating that particularly into the sectors where Europe has comparative advantage.
Would anyone else like to comment?
I don't personally think that AI for now is going to majorly disrupt the balance of power. The countries that we see that are really interested in AI, especially in the military domain, are really the major military powers, the P5, Israel, Japan, for some reason Estonia. I don't see extremely major shifts in the military technological sense. Where we might see a real difference in a revolutionary sense, not necessarily in the capabilities that we have now. It might be that things are used in a different way. I think a lot of the historical technologies is not so much a new better technology, but a very different way of conducting warfare or using weapons in a sense. I think swarming would have the most potential to be some sort of revolutionary thing, but it's also still very far away, and there's a lot of hype again and speculation about what swarmings can really do. AI is not radically new. We've been having it for decades. There's been military investment for decades. It builds on developments in drones, in communication technology. You can see a clear line from the 90s revolution of military affairs discussions about communication technologies. AI is building on advancement in statistics. I don't see a radical departure with the previous technologies of the previous decades.
Yeah, I'd also echo that. I don't see that we'll have a revolution, because historically there have been very few technology revolutions in the military domain. Already. But the things that I think we will see are, it will change the speed. It will change the speed that we analyse information, the speed the speed we want to capture it, the speed we want to analyse it, and the speed we use it to drive decision making. So sadly, I think things are just going to get faster. And I think we will, and again, this is maybe a completely personal view, but I think we'll also see it in non-military activities for military-like advantage. So things like influencing public opinion in nations, in things like cybersecurity attacks or economic attacks on countries. So things where, as we've seen in the last couple of years, where hybrid warfare or even non-military warfare, but certainly national influence is exertion of power is taking place. And I think there will be we will see that kind of application of AI applied by some actors in those kind of fields, because, as we said before, if you've got access to that, you can potentially have a much bigger impact from a relatively small group of people. You can significantly extend your reach. I think we've seen some examples of that happening in the last couple of years.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question, maybe towards the back somewhere. Okay, up here in the front.
So Anna Maria Zonno from DG Research and Innovation. I was curious about this data poisoning. How do you deal with that? Because of course we are very much interested in using data for policy, to make policies, for policy making, and therefore, this could be a very relevant issue to build on your experience on this. Thank you.
Okay.
Who'd like to take that one?
Shall we start? I think firstly, recognise it might happen, and that people might have, that some entities might have a very clear reason as to why they would want it to happen. A little like an alcoholic, recognise that you have a problem, or may have a problem is the starting point. There are some ways where you can apply some of the AI or data science technologies actually to look at that as to where the data might be, where you might see discrepancies between data coming from different sources, where you might see disparity in terms of trends. It is a very difficult question as to how to deal with it. There are some techniques. I think that the world is starting to come to terms with it, to recognise it. Not necessarily that it is a problem right now, but it might be a problem. It's certainly feasible and possible, and I think if you want to make a significant investment in AI, then because you want it to drive competitive advantage or diplomatic advantage or military advantage, then you need to be aware that this is something which might be used against you, and you need to be able to protect yourself against it.
So to build on that, I think you're absolutely right, there are techniques coming in. The thing that I would say is it's about the sophistication of the attack that you're expecting. If it is in a military context or in something incredibly sensitive and you're expecting a very sophisticated attack, I think I should wind up shortly, then you need to make sure you have very good defences. You need to have all sorts of tests in there to check the integrity of the data. If it is in a less contentious area, or it is something where you're not expecting a sophisticated attack, it's just being conscious of the fact that this might happen. You might have a rogue sensor that is feeding enough data and then sends the AI down the wrong channel because it's just inductive logic. So you need to have a resilience. You need to think about how this is doing, and some of the statistical techniques is really good for driving that out. Where the statistical technique falls down is when a sophisticated attacker comes in and has the system for a very long period of time and just drags the sensor out, and that's really difficult to detect, and you can only really detect it when you work out that they've been in your system for the whole time and you start again.
Great, thank you so much. Let's thank the panel.